Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast. I'm Dani, and today Great.com talks with Silky Shaw, the Executive Director of Detention Watch Network. If you haven't heard of it yet, this is a network that works to abolish immigration detention in the United States. Now, if you're new here to this podcast, press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because today we learn about the politics behind immigration detention and how to help people in this situation. Hi, Silke. Welcome to our podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be here.
Now, it's fully our pleasure. This is a subject that I'm very interested in. I say this to you right now because I think I was very touched by the amount of news and the testimonials that I think we saw that all over the world during the Trump administration. And that was very shocking. I think that it, not just for me, maybe for some others as well, it was a really important point to look at the situation and understand it through a different perspective to see what exactly the legal system is for immigration in the United States. But before we get into that, I'm really interested to know about your personal story. And I said this in our previous conversation that I did some research about you as well. And I saw that you have been working with this for a quite long time now. So how did you got into this area? What draw your attention to work with this?
Yeah, happy to share. I'm from Houston, Texas. I'm from Texas. I was born and raised there to um, Indian immigrants. My parents are from India and they came here in the 60s and 70s. And so I come from like a very large immigrant Houston, which is a really diverse and rich city in all these ways. And so when I went off to college, I was, an activist student, sort of seeing what was happening. It was during the like when Bush came into office, and also post 9/11, started to see a lot more immigration detention, targeting of immigrants, targeting people from the Arab Muslim South Asian community, but also a ramping up of immigration detention in Texas in particular, and especially at the border. And so after college, I started working with a group called Grassroots Leadership, which is still based in Texas. And we were trying to really sort of expose the ties that universities had to immigration detention and the private prison industry, which was, you know, making a lot of money, sort of like very interested in because the US government wanted to detain more immigrants. Private prison companies, which sort of like function as parasites, were like, oh, look, this is a way for us to make some money. And then also in Texas, because there was a ramping up of both detaining immigrants, but also prosecuting immigrants for immigration crimes, we started to see a growth of prisons there for immigrants in particular. And so a lot of the work that I was doing then was trying to stop these prisons from being built, to push back against immigration detention. It was also during a period of time when the immigrant rights movement was growing, especially because of a lot of the backlash. And there was these massive marches that happened in 2006. And so a lot of my history of the work comes from both focusing on the rise of mass incarceration in Texas in particular, but also the growth of the immigrant rights movement and sort of the pushback against harsh immigration policies and enforcement. Um, so I did that for a while in Texas, and then eventually I found my way to Detention Watch Network, which I can share a little bit more about that history, but it was great to connect with Detention Watch Network as this organizer in Texas where, a lot of people didn't know about this issue, but here was this group that was doing it at the national level and working with groups across the country. And it felt like we weren't alone doing this work there. And so I eventually started working with Detention Watch Network in 2009 under the Obama administration. And so things were shifting and we saw some opportunity. It's been 13 years now I've been at the organization. There's been a lot of shifts, a lot of, you know, some wins, some really hard times, especially during the Trump era. But it's been remarkable to see how much we've grown, and also how much some of our vision of really pushing against the idea of detaining immigrants in the first place is becoming much more, people are responding to it more.
Wow, that's I think that's the greatest part of it. It's to see people's response to it and see how things have grown since maybe 2001, like when
Yeah.
yeah, the whole thing sort of started to boiling, I think. And in that context, in that more national context, how did the network begin? I
Yeah,
think
we
you're
actually,
celebrating your 25th anniversary this year, right?
yeah, our 25th anniversary is this year, which is remarkable. We actually started a little bit earlier, and it sort of follows the history of immigration shifting in this country. The current immigration detention system we have now has really started to become something more in the 80s. But in 1996, under Clinton, two really harsh immigration laws were passed that basically skyrocketed the number of people being funneled into the detention system. And so at the time, there were a lot of legal service providers, people who are working with people in detention, people who are concerned about what was happening and seeing the growth of numbers of immigrants being detained. And they came together to form Detention Watch Network. So 1997, we were formed. And it was really a space for people who were doing this work across the country to come together, hear sort of different strategies to help get people out of detention. Um, but after 9/11, it's sort of with the informal network, we met. I think the annually, like, the group would meet and sort of like learn from each other. And then after 9/11, um, in New York City in particular, there started, because of the you know, nine the attacks taking place there, and but also just in terms of targeting of immigrant communities, there's all these communities who are being targeted for detention and deportation. And they sort of like found Detention Watch Network and started engaging with it. And so it wasn't just like lawyers and other folks who were providing services, but also now the communities themselves who are being targeted started to join DWN and see the need to, work together to think about how we were going to protect as many people as possible. Um, and there's been some moments where it's required some shifts within the network. So in 2005, we became a national membership coalition. So we actually had formal members. We started having staff. Prior to that, it was much more loose, and so and again in that period, it was still very much of time. It was the Bush era. It was like there were 350 facilities used for detention, jails and prisons across the country, and people didn't know where they could find somebody. So Detention Watch Network provided a map and provided information about some of these facilities, and people were transferred constantly. It was just, how do we do whatever we can for people inside? But it didn't feel like there was necessarily like a ton of opportunity under the Bush era. But then when Obama came in, um, that's when we decided to start building campaigns to start pushing back, and brought on policy organizing. That's where I started at the organization as an organizer, um, to really take advantage of the shift in power to say, okay, how do we push back against detention? And it was hard because under the Obama administration, I think in so many ways, they sort of operated with status quo, and tried to make the system work better, which meant actually more criminalization, and more people were being targeted. So the detention numbers and the deportation numbers rose significantly during that time. And I think for Detention Watch Network, which again was in this place that was like, okay, detention is not something we want. Like, how do we not improve it, but make sure we reduce it away from it? But we realized we weren't making progress. And that's when in 2012, we kind of came to this decision as an organization, as the network, to take on a position of abolishing immigration detention, to imagine a world without immigration detention. Um, and it's been sort of remarkable since then to like see how much us taking that position has like opened up the possibilities for our work and our ability to make the case that actually we don't have to do this. And so we've grown significantly since then. When I started in 2009, we were 4 staff and we had just grown then. Now we're closer to 20 staff, and we have a lot of a lot of staff doing organizing work, but also advocacy and in DC and at the state level, and communications narrative work. And then also we do a lot of work to just bring our membership together to make sure like the sort of best thing we can do is for people to learn from each other about how to organize campaigns or what strategies work. And so that's really what we see our role as.
Well, thank you so much for this overview. I feel like you brought so many aspects of the whole system to us right now. And that got me thinking a few things. But first one is, I love when you say that we are trying to see a future without immigrant detention. And the first question that comes is it possible, right? Like, really, I honestly say that on the state that things are so far, I really have some trouble seeing that in the future. And if you could like help us see that with you, I would love it. And also maybe for our listeners, it's even more complicated if some of them are in the United States, because this is like more a national culture, let's put it that way, because it's been happening for such a long time. And what are the issues that you're seeing with this whole system of immigrant detention that moves you to say we need to be freed of this? So I have those 2 points of questions. What are the issues that you see, and how can we get there?
Yeah, no, I think it's hard, but we have in so many ways it's the sort of another world is possible, and we just have to demand it. I think, it might be hard to see right now, but actually what's sort of remarkable about the Trump era is that it helped people see more why all of this was not things that we needed to do. Like people could understand it more. And I think what's a challenge now under Biden is it's sometimes harder to like make the case whenever you have somebody who's sort of like putting it out that they're pro-immigrant, but then their policies aren't necessarily. So yeah, I mean, I think in terms of immigration detention, the thing to understand is that there's a lot of discretion that the US government has, and people don't need to be detained. I mean, I think there's this framework that's like, well, there's mandatory detention, there's these laws, there's this and that. But actually, it's a civil proceeding, which means that nobody's serving a sentence when they're in detention. They're just there awaiting a hearing on their case, or awaiting deportation, or they're appealing their case and they stay in detention for that period of time. But the US government constantly releases people from detention, even as they're going through deportation proceedings, because of capacity concerns. They actually don't have the physical capacity or resources to detain everybody. And so it sort of pushes this idea of like, actually, this is sort of arbitrary that you're making this choice at all in the first place. And in fact, I think there is this argument. It's like, well, there's a framework that is really criminalizing, where it's like, well, these people have done something wrong and they need to be deported. And the reality is one, our criminal legal system in this country is so fraught, so problematic. So many people are caught up in it because of the way that it operates. And so that's one thing to keep in mind in terms of how people are labeled. But secondly, even, for those individuals who are going in detention after having a criminal conviction, they've already done the thing that the criminal legal system has said, whether it's serving a sentence or been on parole or paid a fine or done any of the things that they're supposed to do. And then it's sort of this double punishment of going to immigration detention. So there's this way that I think we've been able to say, and I think in really so many ways, the summer of 2020, the protests around the killing of George Floyd, really opened up people's eyes to that possibility of like, well, why do we do this in the first place? There's no reason to detain people, actually. Detention really exists to facilitate deportation and nothing else. And even though we know that there's punishment, it is punishment, and it is something that sort of tries to break down the will of immigrants to get them to deport themselves. So like there is very much an intention to isolate and disappear people, but in the sort of practical sense, the only reason they're there is to attend a hearing or be deported. So um I think for us, we've sort of pushed that idea like, hey, actually, instead of somebody being in immigration detention while they're going through immigration proceedings and sort of determining their status, they can just be in there with their family and community. And, they might be, they have family that is dependent on them, or they just, that they should just be free and not be. And I think that is something that has started to resonate with people more. And so it might seem like the conditions are hard right now on immigration, but the truth is, in the last year and a half, we've seen some of the biggest wins we've ever had on immigration detention. And I think it's largely because there was sort of, and we can talk about this more, there was like a lot of us just saying, you shouldn't do this anymore. And a groundswell of like these local campaigns and also a national effort to say reduce, defund, that got us now to shrinking detention system. Right now we're at 25,000 beds is the sort of proposal for the next budget. And we haven't been there in, I think, maybe the last 15, 20 years. So we're actually finally seeing shifts. And I think a lot of it is because of the demand and also the like local work power building on the ground.
Wow, I love to hear you say about all of those things because it really helps to paint a picture and it makes total sense. And that actually helps me to bring tell people about two of your great campaigns that can easily be found on your website, which is, by the way, for everyone listening, you can find that in the description of the episode. But please go to www.detentionwatchnetwork.org, and then you can easily find that you have two campaigns that I loved it. That is Defund Hate and Communities Not Cages. Both of those campaigns, you just addressed the issues, the main issues right there. But how are you developing them? How are they actually being a part of your works right now?
Yeah, I mean, defund hate really came out of the Trump era in 2017, where Trump was trying to get supplemental funding in the federal budget to build the wall. And he was trying really hard to do that. But also, the thing that some people were ignoring, it wasn't just more money for the border wall, but also money for more ICE and CBP agents, Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Customs and Border Protection, like Border Patrol agents, and also more money for detention beds. And so what we did was we sort of like took all those things and said, we brought a pretty broad coalition together. I think there's now more than 50 partners who just said, rather than adding more money to these agencies, let's start cutting. Like we just have to start cutting funding. We have to defund. That's the only way. Like you have more agents, they're going to target more people. You have more detention beds, they're going to target more people. You have the wall, it's going to cause more harm at the border. And so, making that sort of demand consistently over time, I think to date, it's been over $12 billion that have been stopped for additional funding that's been requested by the president or Congress over the last years, however many years, 5 years since defund hate started. So a lot of it is mitigating the harm of the system, making sure we don't have additional funding. But finally, this year, for the first time, we saw the president's budget reduce the number of detention beds by 26%. And that was hugely significant to get there. And again, I think there's sort of, that goes to sort of our other campaign, Communities Not Cages, that really, you know, it made the connection to what was happening in detention for like the broader conversation. So Communities Not Cages is this umbrella campaign, and this actually started after the family separation crisis in 2018, where we really started to see so much more building of immigration detention. Trump really pushing these like massive detention centers, and we said we have to stop this. And so we made a campaign that was sort of umbrella campaign of efforts to stop detention expansion and also shut down existing detention centers. And what that did was all these groups were learning from each other. How do we go after county councils? How do we go after cities? How do we go after the state to curb detention and the use of private prisons and the use of county jails for detention? Block a new expansion from going in. And what all that did was help really, you have the base of support, build the power around this campaign. So the combination of all these places saying, no, we don't want detention, sort of disrupted Immigration and Customs Enforcement's agenda to have like detention everywhere in the country, and sort of force them to sort of, say, do we need to detain people at this level? And that's how we sort of got to this point. So I think it's the combination of the two. I think the one thing I'll flag is much more they're using these sort of invasive surveillance programs on immigrants. But I think it's still important to celebrate the wins on detention, but there is this evolution to where they're using these, phone tracking programs and ankle monitors and other things, which obviously we're not supportive of this either.
Yeah, well, it doesn't make sense, I think, if we're talking about, making
freedom. It's not freedom.
Yes,
but
yeah.
It's not detention. So it's, trying to do our best to both push back against detention and also the growth of surveillance under ICE.
Gotcha. And my final question for you today, I think is the most important one, that is, how can people get involved and help you keep going?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways to get involved. The thing about working on Defund Hate is that like every single congressional representative has a role in the appropriations budget. So educating your local congressional rep about what's happening with the budget, what's happening with immigration in the budget, encouraging them to vote against increases for ICE and CBP and DHS generally, I think is a really important way. In your local community, there might be somebody or like a group that's working against an existing detention center or an ICE contract, locally joining their efforts. I think those are probably like the most direct ways to get involved, but also, encourage folks to go to our website, sign up for our list. We have calls to action regularly where we have phone zaps where you like call folks or email folks. And so I think, there's a lot of different ways to get involved.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today, Suki. I loved talking to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It was really great.
No. Well, and for everyone listening, also thank you. And remember, if you enjoyed this episode, press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because that shows the algorithm that this is an important conversation. And then more people can learn about the importance of the Detention Watch Network. Bye, and see you at the next episode.